Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hello, homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the homebodies out there. Welcome back to another episode of the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh Vissa with Adam Schrader, and today we have another guest with us. His name is Paul Smith. He is one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling. He's one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers, named in 2018. He's a storytelling coach. If you're a storytelling coach, you have to be a #1 best-selling author. And that's what he is, of several books, including the ones that we're going to go over today on this episode. The first one is called Lead with a Story, a guide to crafting business narratives that captivate, convince, and inspire. He's also the author of Sell with a Story, how to capture attention, build trust, and close the sale. Also, there's the 10 stories great leaders tell. And finally, yes, this is relevant to our show, Parenting with a Story, real life lessons and character for parents and children to share. Paul Smith, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Hey, thanks very much. It's good to be here.
Well, you're obviously a master storyteller. So let's start this discussion by talking about how and why it's so important to tell stories in business and in sales.
Yeah, well, I guess, in leadership and business in general, just bossing people around has never really worked that well. Most people don't appreciate that. Of course, sales, you have to do an awful lot of things. But the thing those two endeavors have in common is that you're trying to influence people. And it turns out that human beings make decisions differently than we thought for most of our history on this planet, right? We like to think of ourselves as making these rational, logical decisions, but it turns out that many, if not most of our decisions are made subconsciously in a part of the brain that's really responsible for processing emotions. And then we justify those decisions logically and rationally a few nanoseconds later in a conscious thinking, rational processing part of the brain. So we leave a decision, therefore, thinking that we've made it for rational reasons, but the truth is our kind of reptilian brain already decided for us, and the rest of our brain is just trying to catch up. And all of the rational, logical, arguments and facts and data, which are important, just don't resonate well with that other part of the brain. And so if you want to be the best at influencing people, whether that's in leadership or sales or parenting or marketing or whatever, it turns out you need to talk to both parts of the brain. And stories are just uniquely well qualified to reaching that other part of the brain that our normal daily business language doesn't reach.
So what makes a good story? Like, what elements do you need to make a solid, good story?
Well, a number of things. First of all, I tell the folks I coach, the first thing you have to do is have the right story. So before you ask questions about, well, how do we craft a story to make it better? It starts with having the right story, right? You don't want to tell a story in a fabulous way, but it be the wrong story to tell. That's just going to leave your audience, they're never going to forgive you for wasting their time, right? You're probably not a professional speaker or actor. They're not expecting wonderful delivery. They're expecting you to help them. Like help lead them, help them make a purchase decision, whatever. So the most important thing is that your story is appropriate for the situation and that it's helpful. Then you can work on how to craft it better. But once you've chosen the right story, there are a number of things I think you need to have a good story. You should have a good structure. All good stories have a good structure, right? Lousy stories are a rambling, run-on mess, okay? So you need to have a structure, especially for these business type stories, because well, let me just ask you, how long do you think a good business story is that somebody might tell at the office?
I would hope no
5
more
minutes.
than 3 minutes, 4 minutes.
Yeah, you're both exactly right. It's 3 to 5 minutes. They're not 10 minutes long. They're not 15 minutes long. They're certainly not 2 hours long like in a movie theater. They're not 250 pages long like in a book. These are short stories. So if you don't have a good structure, a tight structure, it's going to be a rambling run-on mess. So structure is one thing. You're going to want to make a good emotional connection. You want to engage the audience emotionally. So there are techniques you can use to create the right emotional engagement. You probably want a surprise ending, right? So you like that in the movies you watch and the books you read, but it's actually important in a business story as well. So most of the same kind of techniques that you would use when crafting a great novel are going to be similar in business, except it's much, much shorter.
Well, that leads me into all the details that need to be shared in a story. And look, I think I was a born storyteller. I even went to school to train to tell stories as a journalist. That's what one of my degrees is in. But in the setting that you're talking about, a business setting, how do you handle people? Because not everyone likes stories. They just want like you said, they just want the ending. They just want the last bit. So how do you kind of find that right medium? Because each person is different.
Yeah, well, okay. Let me hold on to that thought for a minute, because you mentioned being a journalist and trained in journalism. So let me address something there that you didn't ask, but I think for anybody who's either trained in journalism or enjoys reading a good newspaper, there's a difference between a newspaper article and a story. Now, often journalists will call their article a story. I wrote a story in the New York Times. Well, maybe you probably wrote an article for the New York Times, which in my vernacular is a little bit different than a story. A story is a narrative about something interesting that happened to someone, and which might be different than an article in a newspaper. Even if it's about something that happened, the structure is very different. Like you probably learned, did they call it the inverted pyramid structure?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. The inverted pyramid. So the most important stuff first, and then you just go lower and lower, and the least important stuff
is at the end.
Will be last. Yep.
Right. So, and that's exactly the way you should do when you're writing a newspaper article or something for the radio or television or whatever. But if you were writing a novel or a screenplay for a movie, you would never do it that way, right? You'd start at the beginning and go to the middle and go to the end. You go chronologically, right? You don't give away, like, for a newspaper article, it's, family of 4 dies in fire, right? But if you're going to make a movie about somebody dying in a fire, that wouldn't be at the beginning, right? It would happen at the end. Right?
Harry Potter didn't kill Voldemort in the first book.
Exactly, right? So stories operate differently, and they certainly have a different structure than a newspaper article. So I often have people who are in my class who have been trained in journalism, and I have to tell them right up front, this is going to hurt a little bit, because you're going to have to write these, you're going to have to create these differently than you've been trained to, because they're trying to accomplish a different purpose. In fact, they're a different thing entirely. These are real stories, not newspaper articles. So that's one thing I just wanted to get out there. But you asked me, what do you do with an audience who you think is reticent to hear a story? Is that kind of the question?
Yes.
Yeah. So the answer is, first of all, maybe don't tell them a story. So you don't have to always tell a story. In fact, I think only 10 to 15% of the time that you're speaking at work, and probably at home too, should you be telling stories, right? The other 85 to 90% of the time, you should just be talking to people the way you normally do, like you and I are right now. Only 10 to 15% of the time are you telling a story. So if you're in a meeting that's 1 hour long, if you do that math, it works out to, I think, somewhere between 6 and 9 minutes out of the hour that you might be telling a story. And since we already said that these stories are only 3 or 4 minutes long, that means you might tell 2 or 3 3-minute stories during that entire hour. That's it. So most of the time, you should not be telling stories at all. Stories are not the most frequent communication tool you should use, but it probably will be the most powerful. And if you used it all the time, it wouldn't be the most powerful, right? You gotta hold it back for when it's really needed. And if you've got an audience that asks you a yes or no question, then maybe you should just answer their question and save your storytelling for later on in the meeting or later with a different audience or something. I mean, in fact, if you're in a job interview and somebody says, gosh, it looks like your last 3 jobs, you only stayed there for 6 months. Why is that? And you say, well, let me tell you a story. You're going to sound really defensive, like you're trying to hide something. There are times where you should just answer the question directly and don't feel pressure to always tell a story.
So one of the types of stories, the way I've seen businesses do this a lot, and it seems to be a very common sales tool used nowadays, is the whiteboard stories. What are your thoughts on like the whiteboard ads, with the whole scribbling and all of that? Kind of, is that a good way to tell a story, or should it be a much more personal kind of one-on-one talking to the people you're selling to, or your employees, or kind of presenting your business in that way?
Yes. So I think those things can work really well. I mean, human beings are typically pretty visual creatures, and what those animation tools do for you is allows you to create a visual version of the story you're telling. Because when you just tell somebody a story verbally, what they're doing in their mind's eye is they're visualizing the movie of the thing that's happening that you're telling them, right? And usually that's fine. In fact, most of the ways I tell stories are just verbally. And if you tell the story well, if you pick a good story to tell and you tell it well, you don't need those kind of visual aids. But if your story is such that you really want to control exactly the way your audience is visualizing the story, then those kind of tools can help. Like, you don't want them to imagine the story happening any differently than you want them to see it. Then having a visual aid like that definitely helps. It also helps. A lot of those tools are used online, right, where you're competing with flashing ads and pop-up ads and all kinds of distractions, and having a visual aid to keep their attention focused on the story instead of checking their email while they're listening to your story. That is certainly a tactic that can be effective.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback off that because I worked for a direct response marketing company, probably the most successful in the financial publishing space. And their bread and butter is really telling stories through online direct response marketing. I mean, they use the whiteboard animation. They sometimes just use straight up PowerPoint slide decks with transcriptions of what they're saying, but it's visual so that the person can see the words instead of just hearing it. And they've made billions of dollars. I'm not even making that number up. Billions of dollars through this channel of storytelling. And storytelling is incredible. You wrote a book on sales. The book is called Sell with a Story: How to Capture Attention, Build Trust, and Close a Sale. They do all of that. And they utilize the whiteboard animation has been very important to them, but so have other forms of digital media. And now in this work from home space that we're living in, or that where the trend is going, work from home, what are your thoughts on how we can personalize sales given today's online tech and work from home era?
Well, I think it's probably even more important now to tell the right stories to people, and maybe to kind of finish your question about what do you do when your audience doesn't want to hear it. Like, part of my answer is, well, don't always tell stories, but if you tell these stories right, your audience won't even know that you're telling them a story. They won't be thinking, oh, I'm listening to a story right now, right? If you announce that you're going to tell them a story, of course, you've kind of ruined that. But if you just start telling a story and it's only 2 or 3 minutes long, most people won't react badly to that. What they react badly to is that long, boring, 15-minute run-on, irrelevant story that you've wasted 15 minutes of our 60-minute meeting. But if it's just a 2 or 3 minute important short story, most people don't complain about that. And now that we're online, like you're asking now, I think our time with people is even more valuable because we have less time with other people because we're on Zoom calls or we're on Skype here or, whatever. And so we have less of a chance to make those kind of human connections. So I think it's more important to tell stories, and maybe it's more important that they be shorter, so it's more important that they're 2 to 3 minutes and not those rambling 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-minute stories.
So between your two books there, what is the big difference in how you tell a story to lead and how you tell a story to sell?
Yeah, so great question. The way you tell the stories, there's really no difference. One difference is that one of those two types of stories is twice as long as the other. Which do you think is longer and which do you think is shorter?
I would imagine the leading is longer.
And why? Or what do both of you think?
I would think the selling is going to be longer.
Okay, so what are your reasons for that? And then I'll tell you the answer.
Well, having worked in direct response sales or direct response marketing, our sales packages would be minimum 15,000 words, simply because you're making the assumption that the person who you're selling to is starting at scratch. They know nothing about the product or the service or the industry. And so you basically have that fixed amount of time to convince them to take out their credit card and buy something. And you're not going to be able to do that in 2 minutes if they're coming in fresh.
Right. But you're thinking of an entire sales pitch, whereas a sales story really should just be much, much shorter. So you might have 4 sales stories in a single sales pitch, and that's only 10 to 15% of those 15,000 words. The rest of it is it's sales pitch, right? It's here are the reasons to buy my product, and here are the features, and here are the benefits, and here are some testimonials, but none of that is storytelling. There might be 2 or 3 stories that you have in that 15,000 words. So the question is the stories, the individual stories, which of those is longer? And I think it was Adam maybe said this, the leadership stories are probably longer. And that's what I find to be true. The leadership stories tend to be on average about 4 minutes long, and the sales stories tend to be about 2 minutes long. And the reason is because when you're a buyer in a when you're a salesperson in a buyer's office, they have a limited amount of time, and you've got to get your thing done and get out. But when you're the boss at a company and you're talking to the organization, all of whom report to you, you have a captive audience, and they're not likely to throw you out, right? So the reason leadership stories are longer is quite simply because they can be, because the speaker usually gets away with speaking longer.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is you control them.
yeah, you control them. So now, other than that, most of the techniques behind the way you tell these stories are the same. You'll have the exact same structure, which I'll be happy to cover for you in a minute. There are 8 questions both sets of stories needs to answer in the exact order. The same 2 or 3 emotional engagement techniques work. The same technique to create a surprise ending works in both. What's different is what stories you're telling and why you're telling them, right? For leadership stories, you're telling stories like a vision story, a case for change story, a strategy story, a corporate value story, a marketing story. In sales, you're telling stories like stories to explain, what it is that we do simply, or a story to explain how you're different from your competitors, or your company's founding story that's kind of part of your rapport building, or a customer success story, or a story to explain the problem that your product or service solves, or you're telling a story to resolve objections or to close the sale, or a story to build loyalty after the sale. I mean, so part of that book, Sell with a Story, there's 25 specific types of sales stories that great salespeople tell, and I document all of them in the book. In the book, The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, obviously it's a list of 10 stories that leaders tell, right? And that Lead with a Story book, I probably cover 15 or 20 or other types of leadership stories, but the methods are the same. The stories you tell and why you tell them will be radically different, though.
Okay, can you talk about those methods and the structure? I think you said there are 8 of them. You can quickly go through them.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different structures for stories. So we talked about the inverted pyramid, which is perfect for journalism, not so great for this type of storytelling. And there's a lot of others too, right? The Joseph Campbell's hero's journey storytelling structure, the one you learned in high school, kind of a classic Aristotle, So you could probably use, other than the journalism one, you could probably use most of those others and get away with it. But what I find is when I start to talk to people about, well, you've got to have the context, the challenge, the conflict, the resolution, people's eyes kind of glaze over. My audiences, right? If I was talking to a bunch of, creative writing students, that they would probably dig on that. But business people just roll their eyes at that. So what I found works better is giving them these 8 questions that their stories need to answer, and in this order. So the first one is, why should I bother listening to your story? You got to answer that in the first few seconds, or they might not listen to your story. Once you've answered that question adequately, you've earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? All right. So that should sound like the natural flow of a story, and it is. But if you're keeping track, that's only 6 questions, right? So there's 2 more. And so after the story's done, then you got to answer these two questions. What did you learn from the story? And what do you think I should go do now? Do now? I, the person you're telling the story to. So that's your opportunity to draw a conclusion and make a recommendation, right? Because these are business stories, right? You're telling them for a purpose. You're not just entertaining people. You're trying to accomplish something. And so those last two questions help you accomplish something.
So how do you know whether you're a good storyteller or not? Like, it can be really hard to self-evaluate, and it can also be hard, if you are a leader, actually getting an employee to critique you. It's very hard to ask somebody who you're trying to sell, hey, did I tell you a good story? How do you know kind of where you need to improve, and if you even do need to improve then?
Yeah, so my guess is all of us need to improve, but the best answer to that question is, did you accomplish what you wanted to accomplish with the story? So if you're trying to sell something with a story, did you sell it? If you're trying to if you're telling a leadership story to get people to go off and, do the next thing on the strategy document, did they go do it? So if you accomplished what you set out to accomplish, then you probably told the story pretty well. If it didn't work, then you either didn't tell the right story or you didn't tell it very well. So that's the best measure, is did you accomplish your mission? Now there's some other clues you can take, like, did your audience nod off in the middle of your story? Did they start looking at their watch? Did they interrupt you 5 times? Those kind of clues will let you know you're somehow off the mark on your storytelling.
I've got to add a comment about the visuals that we touched on earlier. To me, the visuals have worked out extremely well. And for whatever reason, I asked to give speeches at like friends' weddings, for example. And I used to give speeches where I wouldn't use any visuals. And, it was okay. It wasn't great. But once I started using visuals in my speeches, just pictures,
Mm-hmm.
it like completely changed the reaction and completely changed it. And even for my business presentations, I know a lot of people like getting in front and just taking Q&A and just having a microphone in front of them and talking. But I found that having visuals while I'm speaking, having something planned, it doesn't have to be scripted, but having something prepared, it just resonates so much better with the audience. And so the next topic that I want to discuss, or the next question really, is how do we take these ideas of storytelling and apply it to a public speaking perspective or presentational perspective?
Yeah, so I can tell you what I do, and it sounds like it's similar to what you do, is when I'm doing that, I typically, I use slides, so I'm not like an advocate, oh, you should just stand up there and tell stories for the whole hour you're on stage and not use any slides. 10 to 15% of the time, you should be telling stories. And when I'm teaching, it's much more than that, because I'm teaching them about storytelling, so obviously I need to do it more. But I have slides, but my slides typically just have one picture on each slide with a few words to kind of explain the main point of that slide. And the picture accomplishes 2 things. One, it reminds me which story to tell, right? So if I'm going to tell the story about that meeting in that round office, I'm going to have a picture of that round table or whatever, or whatever. The picture of the dog or the picture of the whatever is going to remind me the story to tell. But for the audience, it gives them a visual image to hang the memory on, right? Because people remember visuals more than they remember verbal cues. If you probably learned that in your college psychology class, right? So if you give them a visual to remember, they'll remember the story and all of the lesson and the facts and everything that you want better if they've got that visual cue to hang things on. So that's what I do. Now I don't use animated stuff when I'm doing a live presentation. I have made some of those storyboarded type graphic animation tools when I'm creating a pre-recorded training program. I never do that when I'm live, because I don't want to distract people so much that they're looking at the screen instead of me, right? If I'm the speaker, if you're the speaker, you want the audience to pay attention to you, not the screen, not the slides. You are not there to augment and help the slides. The slides are there to augment and help you. So I don't even use fancy transitions between my slides. You can make them do all kinds of things. And I just think that's distraction and noise. I want people to focus on the story that I'm telling.
Now, speaking of telling stories there, you have written all of these books that have done really well, but on one of your recent podcasts, you said that you feel awkward introducing yourself as a best-selling author. Why would you, the man who tells stories and teaches people to tell stories, feel awkward doing that?
Well, just because I think it sounds arrogant. I mean, I certainly don't mind when you introduce me as a best-selling author, but there's just something about me saying, hey, Adam, I'm a best-selling author. It just sounds arrogant, right? I don't mind telling you, hey, I'm an author, but the best-selling part just sounds arrogant. I definitely want to be introduced that way. If somebody pays me a lot of money to come up on stage and talk to 1,000 people, I think they should say that as part of my introduction, but I don't want to have to say that just because I think it sounds cocky.
Yeah, I think that's I'm an author myself, and best-selling author. I think you're right. For a second, I was like, oh, do we have to go back to edit how I introduced you? But you're a best-selling author, and I'm proud to call you to have a best-selling author on our show and to be interviewing someone like you on our show. So I will continue to call you a best-selling author.
Well, please do. Thank you. so that I don't have to.
Yeah. Now, talking a little bit about your best-selling book, Parenting with a Story, Real-Life Lessons and Character for Parents and Children to Share. Should parents use stories to illustrate to their children how life works, how choices and consequences play out in the real world?
Yes, they do. And by the way, in full transparency, that is one of my books that was not a bestseller, although I think it should be. You, as an author, you're always going to have some that do better than others. And unfortunately, that's not one that hit the bestseller list. But,
that's surprising.
Yes, I do think. In fact, we all know this, right? Well, are you guys parents? I don't know.
Yeah,
I have 4.
Okay. Well, okay. Oh man, bless you. So that there are times when your kids do something and you want to, it's a teachable moment, and you want to give them some of your worldly wisdom. There are times where it's been like, oh man, let me tell you, when I was your age and I did this thing and it was just so stupid, and I got grounded, or I got in trouble, or I got hurt, I ended up in the hospital, whatever. And you're telling them this story about something that happened to you that taught you this lesson that you want them to learn from it so that they don't suffer the same bad consequences you did. I mean, that is parenting at its best, where you're telling them, you're sharing with them this embarrassing moment from your life, so because you care more about their growth and development than you care about protecting your own fragile ego, right? That is great. That's great parenting. The problem is, most of us don't have enough of those wonderful life stories to teach our kids everything that we want them to know, right? We want our kids to, have, to be creative and innovative, and to be kind and patient and hardworking and, frugal. And you just list all of the character traits you want your kids to have. And you probably only have 2 or 3 book-worthy stories, life lessons about stuff like that. But Adam, you've got a few, and Naresh, you've got a few, and I've got a few. And so what I did was I interviewed 100 people for that book, 100 interesting people, to find 101 life lessons. And then I the kind that, like, your best 1 or 2 best life stories. And I categorized them by what lesson did people learn from that story. And that ended up becoming the chapters of the book. I just, by those character traits, like I said, whether it was kindness or patience or fairness or justice or hard work or, whatever, honesty, integrity. And so you turn to that chapter, and there'll be a handful of stories from people, all over the world. I think they interviewed people in 25 countries around the world, where something really interesting and life-changing happened to them that taught them a lesson about that character trait in a way that they'll never forget. And if you read that chapter, if you're having a problem with your kid on, whatever character trait, turn to that chapter, read a few of the stories, and there'll probably be 1 or 2 of them that really will resonate with your kid that you could share to teach them that lesson.
All right. Well, it sounds like I'm going to the Kindle store and buying a book whenever we're done with this.
There you go.
But sometimes when you're parenting and when you're leading and all of that, sometimes you're not sure, with your kids, sometimes it's just, hey, don't jump off that because you're going to hurt yourself. What's the best way that you've found in terms of when it's appropriate to just say, because I said so, whether you're a boss or a parent, and when the story should come in? Like, if you need to just stop it, should you just tell it right away and then deal with the story later? Or kind of what's your opinion on how to go about that?
Yeah, so my wife and I have had that conversation a number of times, and here's where we came out. If it is so urgent that there is not time for us to tell you the story, meaning there isn't even 2 or 3 minutes for us to tell you this before you need to know this information, then you just have to do what I say. And those kind of things are like your toddler's about to walk out into the street and get run over by a car. There's no time for me to tell you a story. It's just stop. And, by golly, you better stop, right? And so, in fact, we even came up with a different word for stop because of that, because you tell your kid to stop doing stuff all the time, and half the time they listen, half the time they don't. But we came up with the word freeze. If I ever say freeze, then it means it is a life-changing, threatening situation. And kid, you better stop exactly where you are and don't move a muscle. Now, if I tell you to stop, hitting your brother, then, I still mean it, but it's not going to kill anybody if you don't. But if I say freeze, right? I'll tell you the story later. So to me, there's almost always time. In fact, you're probably all familiar with Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, right? I'm a big fan of that concept that if you explain to them why they should do something that you're telling them to do, they're far more likely to go do it than if you just tell them to go do it. And I run into these examples in my own life all the time. And I'll just tell you one of them. I was visiting my brother at his house out of state. And at one point I wanted to go to the gym to work out. So he gave me a guest pass and told me the address. And so I drove there in my car and went to the gym. And I'm pulling out. I'm starting to pull out of the parking lot of the gym. So this place I'd never been before, down a road I'd never been down before. And I wanted to turn left to go back home because I pulled right into the parking lot, and to go home, I knew I had to turn left to go back to his house. But there was a sign in the parking lot that said no left turn. And I'm like, well, if I turn right, and this is before the days of like everybody had a GPS in their pocket. And I'm like, I don't know how to get back to his house if I don't turn left, because that's where I came from. Like I'm looking at the street. I've got to go up that way. So I just turned left. And within like 15 seconds, I regretted it. I pulled over the next hill, and there were a line of cars coming straight at me. I had pulled the wrong way on a one-way street. Okay. And there was medians on both sides. Like I couldn't get out of the one-way street. It wasn't, there were trees. Like I couldn't move.
And so, not a time to freeze.
Yeah, not a time to freeze. So, I had to stop the car, and I didn't cause an accident, but I caused a traffic jam for a few minutes while I did a K-turn to, get myself out of this situation. Now, here's the lesson. If that sign just said no left turn, okay, I typically follow rules, but that one just seemed like a bad rule. Like I needed to go that way. If the sign instead had said one way with an arrow pointing the other direction, I would have never turned left, right? You'd have to be insane to go down a one-way street the wrong way on purpose, right? Now, the one-way sign, the don't turn left, is a sign that tells you what not to do. One way doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you which way the traffic is going. Then you can make your own choice. And of course, you're going to choose to go the correct direction. So telling people why it's important to not turn left is far more important than telling them to not turn left. And I find that to be the case with kids, and people you're leading at work too. The stories can explain why something is important. And so wagging your finger at them and telling them to not do this or to do that is just not going to be as effective as the story, because the story explains why.
That's a great story that you just told. It really is, because I see signs that say, don't turn right, don't turn right on red, and you see people just rolling right through it and ignoring the signs. But you see that one way, and everyone's obeying that, right? And it kind of goes to show. It's similar to the times that we live in. The politicians say wear face masks, and you got decent amount of people say I'm not wearing the face mask, or Stay at home. I'm not staying at home. You, don't kneel. You need to stand up. Well, I'm still gonna kneel. That's just kind of how. It's not just kids. I mean, I guess kids do it more, but it's just kind of human behavior. It's like we're told to do one thing and we want to do the opposite, and it's largely because maybe we don't want to be told what to do.
Somebody didn't make the case yet.
Yeah. And we see it countless times throughout our own lives. And I think I know why you're thinking about your parenting book. You said that's not a bestseller. And when I think about it, I mean, I have people reaching out to me all the time for business advice. Hey, I want to quit my job. I want to start this business. I want to write this book. How do I get clients? And or people who I work with, they're rarely hit up to get parenting advice. It's almost like some kind of stigma or shame, like, oh, I don't need to get parenting advice. Like,
I'm an awesome parent.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the same with storytelling too, I find. A lot of people assume that storytelling is just the kind of thing you're either born with or you're never going to have. Right. And I just think that's not true. I think storytelling is an art form, right? So it's like music or dance or painting or something. There are certainly people who are naturally gifted at those things. But if you're not one of them, it doesn't mean you can't learn to do it. You may never fill up Carnegie Hall with people wanting to listen to you play the guitar or something. But, like I'm not a naturally gifted musician. But I'll bet if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, I bet I could, right? And what would I do? I'd go hire a teacher, a guitar teacher, and I'd take lessons, right? And eventually I would learn. And storytelling is the same way. Yes, there are people who are naturally better at it than others. But if you're not, that's fine. Just go take a class, read a book, watch some videos, learn how to do it. You can. It's an easy skill to learn.
Awesome. Well, Paul Smith, one of the world's leading experts on organizational storytelling. We've gone through a lot of your books. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience, Paul, regarding parenting or storytelling in business and sales?
Well, if I could, just selfishly, the one book we didn't talk about is actually my most recent one. And it's actually the one I'm the most proud of because it's very different than all the others. It's called 4 Days with Kenny Tedford, Life Through the Eyes of a Child, Trapped in a Partially Blind and Deaf Man's Body. And so you got to imagine this guy. He's kind of like a combination of Helen Keller and Forrest Gump, right? I mean, he's got all the physical challenges of Helen Keller, deaf and blind in one eye and couldn't speak till he was 10 years of age. But he's also got the cognitive challenges of Forrest Gump, even though Forrest Gump's fictional, right? I mean, he's got a significant learning disability that has him mentally at about the level of a third grader, even though he's a grown man. And so can you imagine somebody going through life with both of these sets of challenges? And so that book is essentially his life story, which is just fascinating. And of course, it's your life is a series of stories. So I enjoyed it as a storytelling writer to write this guy's life story. But yeah, I've never met anybody like him in my life. And it was just an honor to try and document the joys and sorrows and craziness and heroic points and just destitute points of this man's tumultuous life. So I can't advocate that one enough.
Excellent. Well, definitely want our listeners to check that book out as well. All of Paul's books are available on Amazon, and Paul's website, leadwiththestory.com, leadwiththestory.com. Is that correct, Paul?
That is. Thank you.
All right, leadwiththestory.com. Check it out. Again, Paul Smith, best-selling author of Lead with a Story, A Guide to Crafting Business Narratives that Captivate, Convince, and Inspire. Sell with a Story, How to Capture Attention, Build Trust, and Close a Sale. The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. And Parenting with a Story, Real Life Lessons and Character for Parents and Children to Share. And share one more time, Paul, the name of your new
newest
book.
One? Yeah, 4 Days with Kenny Tedford, Life Through the Eyes of a Child, Trapped in a Partially Blind and Deaf Man's Body.
Excellent. Well, Paul Smith, thanks so much for joining us on the Work From Home show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Excellent. And to all our listeners out there, check us out. workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. Get on our mailing list. See all of our previous episodes, listen to our previous episodes. We're on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, you name it. We're anywhere and everywhere podcasts are available. We thank all of you for continuing to listen to us and growing our audience. Wow, it's pretty amazing how far we've come and how much we've grown just over the last 6 to 7 months. So we greatly, greatly appreciate that. And until next time, keep on working from home.